Well, here we are talking about the Northwest Ordinance passed by Congress in 1787. And it was passed, and it became law, and as I said, it was a very successful law that provided good guidance for our whole expansion, the way that we acquired additional territory and eventually brought it into the Union as a state, and we did that with every state following the basic principles set out by the Northwest Ordinance. But when Congress was passing the Northwest Ordinance, they ran into this big, huge obstacle. And we don't know the details of how they resolved that. We have some speculations based on some circumstantial evidence, but in fact, there's no written documents, there's no actual solid evidence to show how this controversy was resolved. We know the result, we know what the law was passed. The issue was slavery. Many Northerners in Congress, which I told you was meeting in New York, but many of the Northern Congress members came to Congress wanting to abolish slavery in the Northwest Territory. And Southerners strenuously objected. And that issue turned out to be a very dragged out, contentious issue, led to a great deal of debate and argument in Congress. And eventually, the law was passed, and the law did indeed prohibit slavery in the Northwest Territory. We don't know how that happened. We can only speculate based on some, I'll tell you a little bit of the evidence that we have to kind of go back and forth and figure out what happened that Congress eventually passed the law that the Northerners wanted. I want to talk about why Northerners opposed slavery in the Northwest Territory. I want to make clear, Northerners are not more moral than Southerners. Northerners are not like somehow better equipped to defend American ideals that all men are created equal. It isn't that they have any more higher standard of trying to make America a true republic, not just for white males. They're no different from Southerners in that regard. And especially on this issue of racism, Northerners were just as racist as Southerners during this debate over slavery in the Northwest Territory. What guides their decision, and what put them into the position of opposing slavery, is what's going to lead to the opposition to slavery for the rest of the class, the rest of the whole semester until we get down to the Civil War. Never was that people thought that slavery was wrong. The number of people who did that was, we'll eventually find there were going to be some people eventually, when we get to the 1830s, who are going to say slavery is just wrong. But as of the 1780s, basically nobody in America says that. Everybody sort of agrees that slaves, that African Americans are simply incapable by racial trait of becoming true Americans. There's this strong sense of racism that I mentioned before that's widely held even by people who did not really approve of slavery. But they, as I told you, they could not conceive of an American nation with two races, and actually three if you include Native Americans, because the same racism applied to all people of color. And they could not accept the idea that we could just be one integrated nation where race did not play a role. They could not get over their racism. They could not get beyond that. They basically considered blacks as inferior and as incapable of living in the same society as white Americans. But and so when northern states looked at the whole issue of slavery, yes, they did finally begin to abolish slavery. And eventually, the original 7 states that would be northern states all abolished slavery. But they did so in a sort of a halfway, kind of backward way. No state just flat out passed a law and said, slavery is wrong, we're not going to have it in our state, we're going to abolish slavery in this state of whatever, Pennsylvania, New York, whatever. And each state is a little bit different. It's kind of complicated. I'm not familiar with the details of every single state as to how they went about it. But what they did was they kind of would do it sort of gradually. They would do it sort of reluctantly. They would a common way to do it was to say, well, from now on, everybody born in the state is going to be free, which would mean that eventually we would sort of phase out as people died, as the older people got past age and died, the slaves that were now there would all die out, and then the slavery would go away. But everybody who was then a slave had to stay a slave, and they had to remain a slave for the rest of their life. And they didn't want to take away the asset of the slave owner. And I just sort of touched on another reason why Northerners are not going to go after slavery. They're not trying to get rid of slavery in their states. They finally did so because, it was just too obviously a violation of American principles. But the other thing that held it back was that slaves were property. And as such, they're part of our rights, property rights. And governments protect property rights. The government can't take away your property. And freeing the slave would amount to taking away your property. And so states just said, well, we can't take away people's property, we can't abolish slavery. Now there's a solution to that problem. And the solution is pretty obvious. What you do is you compensate the owner for the slave. You pay him. In a sense, you buy the slave from him, and that way you're not taking away his property. You're giving him compensation. And many people advocated that as an option. By the time we're going to get to the 1830s, 1840s, we're going to find more and more Americans advocating some kind of compensated emancipation. Free the slaves, but compensate the owner because it's property. The problem with that was just the numbers. You look at how many slaves there are, you look at the going market price of a slave, and the cost of trying to liberate slaves by paying their owners just becomes excessive and impossible to think about. So yeah, there were some movements to do it. There were some private parties who raised money and used it to compensate owners in order to free slaves. There were people in this country who didn't like slavery. But they have to live with the idea that a slave is property, and that's going to be the obstacle. They could do it, but only in a very limited way, and so they did compensate owners, and slaves got freed by Northerners raising money to compensate the owner. But that just isn't going to go very far because, as I say, it's just the money is just too out of control. Now, the other problem that I've talked about is, what do you do with the slave after they're freed? And there's an obvious answer to that one, is that you relocate them somewhere. And in fact, a lot of people who thought we should get rid of slaves get rid of slavery, advocated relocating slaves. And there were all sorts of places that were proposed as sites to relocate them, send them out west, and let Indians try to deal with them, impose them on the Indians, or send them down to the Caribbean somewhere, send them to Brazil, which had a very large slave population. It was a very large country. But the obvious, most common place was to send them back to Africa. And in fact, that was done. I told you there were Americans who raised money and used private funds to free slaves by buying them from their owners. And one of the things that they did was to send them to Africa. And they set up a country there. I don't know if you know the country, the modern day African nation of Liberia was established by Americans as a place to relocate slaves who had been acquired from their masters through compensation. And you know, Liberia exists to this day as a country that was established by Americans. Its capital is Monrovia. It was named after President Monroe. So there are two world capitals that are named after ex-U.S. presidents, Washington, D.C. and Monrovia, Liberia. So we did that. I mean, we sent people back. But again, the numbers are just overwhelming. I mean, you could send, you know, a small number of people back and take them to Africa and set them up there in power and dislocate the native Africans who were living there. But you know, you can make only a tiny dent in the total slave population because there are so many slaves, and the cost of relocating is just prohibitive. So nothing much goes with that. So we're not really ready to, and nobody really wants to just abolish slavery. And that's not what led to Northerners to oppose slavery in the Northwest Territory. It wasn't that they felt slavery was wrong and they just weren't going to allow slavery to exist there. They're not going to let the Northwest Territories just become a bastion of freedom. Now, what motivated Northerners was the fear that slavery might be used as a form of labor in the Northwest Territories. Now, the Northwest Territories are in a non-labor-intensive agricultural area. The Northwest Territories are like northern states. The demand for slavery is not great. The price of slaves is lower. There isn't as much need for slave labor there as in the South with its labor-intensive agriculture of products such as sugar and rice and tobacco. But the fear of Northerners is that slavery might be adapted to northern agriculture, which is basically grain-based agriculture, raising wheat, corn, and other grains such as barley and oats and so forth. And what Northerners feared was that if slavery were allowed into the Northwest Territory, that slave owners might start using slave labor for the production of northern agricultural products, to use them for raising wheat. Everybody knows you're not going to grow sugar in the Northwest Territories. You can't. Everybody knows you're not going to raise much rice there. The nature doesn't allow it. But you could use it for raising wheat. And if you did, then you're going to be competing against northern farmers back in the Northeast, in states like New York and Pennsylvania. And if slave labor competes against the free labor of the North, it might lower the price of agricultural products. It might therefore lower the income of northern farmers. And so northern farmers don't want to have to face that competition. They don't want to see slavery get established in the Northwest because it might become competitive to their agriculture. As long as slavery is used for things like sugar and tobacco, it's no problem. But the danger that you could use slavery in the Northwest for growing things like wheat would pose an economic threat to northern farmers. So what they care about is their economy. They care about their income. They care about the price of agricultural products limited to northern agriculture. It's not a matter of the morality of slavery. Nobody cares about that. So yes, Northerners don't want slavery in the Northwest. Southerners do. Southerners want the opportunity to take their slaves into the Northwest and see if they can make money using slaves in the production of wheat. They want to try to do that. So the debate over slavery in the Northwest is not a debate over slavery per se. It's a debate over two economic systems which are competitors or could be competitors, and some people want to compete and some don't want them to be able to do that. So that's why Northerners didn't want slaves in the Northwest Territory and why Southerners did. Well, they agreed not to. And as I say, we don't know the details of that agreement. There were some closed-door meetings, some private meetings, of which there is no record, but they agreed to allow slavery to be abolished in the Northwest Territory. What we think is that there was an assumption that slavery would be allowed in the Southeast. Now that's not, as of 1787, that was not yet under the control of Congress. The southern states, the three southern states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, had all not yet decided to relinquish their claims. Virginia had, but the other three southern states had not. So Congress didn't have jurisdiction over the Southeast. But the assumption was, which turned out to be true, eventually that'll happen. Eventually those three southern states are going to follow the lead of Virginia. It's very hard to sort of say, well, we're going to still own our land when Virginia said we don't want to. So eventually we assume that those three southern states will also relinquish their claims to that land. Congress will obtain jurisdiction over it, and when that happens, then we will have slave states there. So we're going to have northern states, non-slave, southern states allowing slavery. And we've sort of drawn a line across the country that marks that division. There are the 7 northern states. Of the original 13, they abolished slavery. And then the Northwest Territory, sort of the extension of that to the west, has also been made non-slave by the Northwest Ordinance. Southern states, the original 6 southern states that had slavery, will all keep slavery. And then the Southeast, as sort of an extension of that, will become area also for slavery. So we've sort of divided the country. And we've got northern states, no slaves, southern states, slaves. And we're basically comfortable with that. That sort of settles the issue. That's a compromise. Northerners got to have no slavery in the Northwest, but the assumption was that Southerners would get to have slavery in the Southwest, and that turned out to be true. So Congress settled that issue, and they did pass the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. But while this has been going on, and yes, Congress is doing some good things, the problems persist. And many Americans are very unhappy with the Articles of Confederation. And there's a growing sense that the Articles are not working. Congress is not able to deal with the problems. We've got all of this rivalry going on among the states with passing tariffs, with passing trade laws, passing laws to get at each other, and they're all trying to stab each other in the back. That's all that everybody is doing is just stabbing. Everybody stabs everybody, And so everybody gets stabbed and nobody gets hurt. I mean, everybody gets hurt. Everybody's hurting everybody else. So it's just an impossible situation. And Congress can't do anything about it. And then here, of course, Congress has no way to get money. And yeah, eventually we're going to start getting money, but we haven't started that. That hasn't started working yet. So there are people who are going to be agitating to make some changes and to do something about the articles. We've got to get the articles to be fixed. We've got to change them. And the two obvious things to do is we have to give Congress the power to tax. We've got to let Congress regulate trade instead of each state legislature. There are people who are going to be agitating for this. These are people who sort of, it's just kind of like an underground movement of people who are friends. They know each other. They have contact with each other. Mostly they're merchants. Mostly they're businessmen who have business ties with each other. They're friends. They deal with business back and forth across the state line, and they communicate with each other. And I'm going to sort of start getting a little bit ahead of myself here in starting to use a word to describe these people, even though they weren't really using that word yet. They weren't any kind of a conscious organization. I'm going to give them a name as though they were. They weren't. They were just a bunch of guys who sort of know each other and send texts back and forth to each other. They send emails to each other bitching about the Congress, how it doesn't work and how the country's in terrible shape and we got to fix it. But I'm going to start calling them Federalists, a word that they would eventually adopt as sort of an actual organization. And I'm going to be telling that the guy that's probably the leader of this movement, who's sort of the key one to start kind of spreading the word from one person to another and is sort of the central location of all of the complaints. His name was Alexander Hamilton. He was not himself a merchant. He was from New York, but he was a lawyer. But he knew merchants and he had worked with them. And he played a key role during the Revolution as a staff member of the Continental Army. He was sort of the finance manager for the Army. His title was aide-de-camp, as sort of an associate of a second to Washington himself. But his responsibilities were not so much for military leading as it was finance, handling the business side of the Army. And so he was the guy who was real aware of what a problem it had been for the Army to have money, because he was the guy who was responsible for the money. He knew there was never enough. So he was well aware of what a struggle it was to get the Army going and to be able to survive during the Revolution. But he is spreading the word. And one of the issues that came up in 1786 was a dispute between two states that are forever rivalries, Maryland and Virginia, which are right next to each other, and the border between them is the Potomac River. And under the Articles, Maryland says the Potomac River is in our jurisdiction, and so we have a set of rules and regulations for trade on the Potomac. And Virginia says, no, it's ours. We have responsibility for regulating trade on the Potomac. So there's this dispute between Maryland and Virginia over what to do about trade on the Potomac. So with Hamilton kind of working behind the scenes, the two of them, the representatives from those two states, had a meeting actually at the home of George Washington, which is right on the Potomac River. And so they met there, and Hamilton was there because he kind of said, well, why don't you guys get together and let's talk about it. Let's figure out some way that you can have this done. And the point that he made to them, he came to that meeting and he said, look, we should have a meeting of all of the states to talk about this whole issue of regulation of trade. Yes, there's one issue here. It's specifically between Maryland and Virginia over the Potomac, but a lot of other states have arguments. There's these tariff laws that they're passing against each other. This whole matter of trade regulation, every state is having trouble with it. Every state is having problems with regulation of trade. Let's have a meeting. And the word that they'd been using for meeting, remember, this is not the first time that they've had a meeting. I mean, they had been doing this since 1764 and the Stamp Act. This is now 1786. So they know about the idea of having a meeting, and they used to call it a Congress. Well, now the Congress is a different thing, so that word has sort of evolved into the governing body, the legislative body for whatever you call the Articles of Confederation. So let's just use another word. It means the same thing, it's just the same word. Let's call it a convention. The word convention is sort of the replacement for the word Congress, because the word Congress has gone off to another meaning. So let's have a convention, and they decided let's have it in Baltimore, which is the capital of Maryland. And no, Annapolis, not Baltimore, Annapolis, Maryland. Let's have a convention in Annapolis, and let's just talk about problems that we're all having with the fact that the Articles of Confederation are not working, Congress is not working. Let's just get together and meet. So they held a convention in Annapolis in the early fall of 1786. Well, it was a disaster. Of the 13 states that were invited, only 5 sent a delegation. 8 states refused to have anything to do with the convention. And ironically, one of the states that refused was Maryland, which was the host. And the state legislature of Maryland passed a law saying that nobody could use the state offices of the state of Maryland. The state has, the logical place to have it is the State House, which would be the state capital of the state of Maryland, which is in Annapolis. But no, you can't have your meeting there. You can't have your meeting in any other state facilities. And I actually don't know where they met. They met somewhere, found someplace in Annapolis, but Maryland was not there. 7 other states were not there. There were only 5 states there. Why didn't want to, I mean, if the country is facing problems, why don't they want to deal with it? Well, it's a little complicated, and we don't know for sure what the answer is. We can only sort of surmise based on what we do know about the 8 states that are refusing to go. They're afraid that this is some plot to oversee their legislatures, previously the assemblies. And we know, I hope you've been following, and I hope you can remember and understand that this is an important thing that's going on, is that Americans are committed to their assemblies, now called legislatures. Same thing, it's just a change of the word. And it's changed from being colonies to being states. But the colony had always placed a great deal of emphasis on its assembly as a key to its freedom. Here we are, the book, Give Me Liberty. And Americans, when they talked about liberty, one of the things that they put at the top of the list was the fact that they had their own assemblies, that they got to elect their own representatives, and that their representatives governed them, that they were governed by their own chosen people. That's what America has. That's what America is all about. That's what makes us better than everybody else. Nobody else has in this country, in the world, has anything like a self-governing body, an assembly like the Americans had. And that's the key to our freedom, or that's one of the most important parts about our freedom. Of course, it's based on land ownership, and that's the key to freedom. I mean, everybody that gets to vote is a landowner, and those are the people. Those are the people who run the society. Those are the people who own the land, who have an investment in the land, who have a stake in the land, who have a stake in the what had been a colony, now it's a state. Those are the people who run things, and that's us. We are self-governing. We have our own government. We control our own lives. We have freedom. We control our lives through our assemblies, legislatures. And what they're afraid of is that these guys that I'm going to call the Federalists, might be up to some trick to take away their power. I mean, if you remember back to the Albany Plan of Union, 1754, 30 years earlier, there had been the Plan of Union, and it was rejected because the members of the assemblies felt that it was going to be a limitation on their power, on the power of the assembly. And always in the disputes with England, underlying those disputes was the fear that what Parliament was up to was a plan to get rid of their assemblies. That this whole question of taxation is just a guise by Parliament to start being able to govern instead of the assemblies. That Parliament, that no taxation without representation, that only our assemblies can govern us, only our assemblies can tax us. And they thought that what Parliament was trying to do was take away the power of their assembly. Parliament's going to start taxing and say, we tax, you don't. And that was going to be the key to the loss of our freedom. If Parliament gets away with that, they'll take away our freedom. And what Parliament had been trying to do back in the 1760s, many of the members of the state legislatures in this country thought these Federalists were trying to do here in 1786. They're trying to take away our assembly, our power. We don't want to have anything to do with it. No way. We're not going to send anybody. So the delegates from the 5 states sat there and looked at each other and they said, well, this is fun. What are we going to do? Well, I don't know. What do you want to do? And they said, well, there's nothing we can do. I mean, let's go home. And Hamilton said, well, wait a minute. Let's not give up on this yet. Let's see. Maybe the problem is that we didn't say in the invitation that we sent out to have you all come to this convention, we didn't say what it was going to do. So people are suspicious because they're afraid, they're not telling us what they're going to do. So that maybe they've got some dirty plan. Maybe the worst is they might even be getting ready to have a monarchy again. They might be trying to establish a monarchy instead of our Republican state legislatures. So, but look, maybe that's why it failed. Maybe that's why nobody wanted to come. Hamilton is trying to explain. But let's send out another message. Let's try again. Only this time we'll say specifically what the convention is going to do, so that the legislatures don't have to worry that there's something going on that we're not telling them about, and we can get this to go. So they sent out invitations, and they said, look, let's have a convention in the summer of 1787. We'll meet in Philadelphia. We'll have a convention then. And what the convention will do, and the only thing that it will do, we'll talk about amending the articles, because the articles, in order to be amended, the amendments have to be ratified. And every state has to ratify. So every state legislature can know, they can be confident that if we do something that they don't like, if we propose some amendments to the articles that one state doesn't like, they don't have to ratify it, and then it won't happen. That gives every state control over this whole situation. And maybe if they know that they can't be snuck around, that nobody can do anything without their approval, maybe they'll be willing to send. And maybe we can talk about getting some amendments here, and that will be satisfactory. It has to be satisfactory to every state legislature, or it's not going to happen. We have to get along with all the state legislatures, and we can do this. So okay, so the invitations go out, and then they're starting to think about it. This is now in the fall of 1786, when the Baltimore Convention ends up in just a complete fiasco. All right, so the invitations go out, and the states are then deciding whether they're going to send a delegate or not. And maybe it's a little bit hard. Every state's different, and the state legislature in each state is doing it, and then some of them are meeting and some are not. Every state is different. It's a little bit hard to get your handle on this whole thing. But and maybe they would have done, or maybe not. We don't know. Nobody knows what would have happened if something else hadn't happened. And something happened in Massachusetts in the winter of 86, 87. And what happened in Massachusetts was that some of the mortgage holders, some of the wealthy people who own mortgages, are finally starting to try to foreclose on some of those mortgages. They've had a right to do it all along. They just have chosen not to because they thought, well, what good would it do us? And we don't want to do it. Now, some of them are starting to move on this. And in the western part of the state, it's not in Boston, it's not in the eastern part of the state, it's in the western part of the state, in Springfield. There's a courthouse there, and some of the wealthy people are going to court in the courthouse, and they've got their lawyer, and they're going in there, and they're bringing lawsuits against some of the local farmers who, frankly, are in arrears on their mortgage, and they don't have a leg to stand on. So if these cases are going to go to court, and the courts are going to obey the law and order the mortgage to be foreclosed and transfer the property from the farmer to the mortgage holder who's loaned the money. Well, some of the folks in that area in western Massachusetts say we can't let this happen. Their leader is a guy named Shays, S-H-A, well, I'll write it for you. Thomas Shays. There's a rebellion that's called Shays Rebellion. And what these farmers do, and remember these are Massachusetts farmers who are really struggling. I mean, things are tough for those poor farmers because not only are they in debt to their mortgage holder and they have no way to pay off their mortgages, but they're also paying very high taxes that the state has imposed so that the bonds of the state are all being paid in due process. So there's a rebellion led by this guy Shays, who was a hero of the Revolution. He was a leader of the Massachusetts militia. He had fought in some of the key battles of the war. He had fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill, where a lot of Americans got killed. That was a real tough battle for us early in the war. An incident where a lot of Americans ended up getting killed. And he had been there. He saw, and he's an honest to God hero. He was a guy who was out there as the captain of his militia unit, and he's leading the men, and he's got the gun, and he's shooting, and everybody's shooting at him, and he's out there putting his life on the line. And he had really done that, and he'd survived, and now he's leading this rebellion. And what they did was they just said, we're not going to let the court open. A bunch of guys with their guns just surrounded the courthouse and said, well, the courthouse is closed. And they wouldn't let the lawyers in, they wouldn't let the judges come in, they wouldn't let the clerks come in, they wouldn't let the court proceedings go on. And that way, the property owners, the people who own the mortgages, their legal position is absolutely solid, but they can't, if they can get to court, if they can get a judge, they can say that the property belongs to them, but the judges can't even come into the building, because it's surrounded by the mob. Well, what do you do when you've got a mob insurrection? Well, the first thing you do is you rely on local law enforcement, which is the sheriff, the local sheriff. And the sheriff is just saying, I don't have the guns, I don't have the manpower to deal with this mob. The mob is bigger than anything I've got. So, you know, the local government that can't do it, so you go to the state. And the state has militia. And then if the sheriff can't deal with it, then you bring in the militia. That's today's National Guard. And the militia, the governor of the state and some of the other state leaders who would have to send the militia out there, they're saying, wait a minute, do we want to send the militia against a veteran, a war veteran of the militia, a guy who'd been a leader of the militia during the war? Is the militia going to fire on their fellow militia members? Let's think about this. I don't think we want to do this. I don't think we can count on the militia to be involved in military force against their fellow militia members. So then you go to the national government and you get the U.S. Army. If the militia, the National Guard can't handle the situation, you go to the next level, you go to the U.S. government, the national government, and the U.S. Army. And some of you may have figured out that they didn't do that for the obvious reason. There was no such thing as the United States Army. You know, Congress, with no taxation power, had not been able to keep the Army going, right? I mean, we struggled through the war with the Continental Army, but as soon as the war was over, we sent the Continental Army home, and we don't have an army. So then what do you do? There's no answer. It turns out that, in fact, that under the Articles, the way things were, and with the way things are in Massachusetts, and with Shays' Rebellion underway, the government cannot protect the property of those mortgage owners. I mean, it's legally, the property belongs to them. I mean, you know, the farmer who'd owned it had borrowed money, he'd taken out a mortgage, he had defaulted on the mortgage, he hadn't been paying the mortgage, so legally the property belongs to the mortgage lender. And the mortgage lender, you know, legally it's his right, but he can't do it because there's a mob and there's nobody can deal with the mob. So we think that Shays' Rebellion convinced a lot of Americans we got to do something about these articles. The Federalists are right. They're not working. We've got to do something. So 12 states sent delegates to Philadelphia for this new convention, the second convention that they're going to try to have, that the Federalists are trying to put together and that Hamilton is trying to get going to start figuring out how to amend the Articles. One state refused to send a delegation, and that state is not a surprise. Some of you may be able to kind of guess correctly which state refused to send a delegation to the Philadelphia Convention, and that was Rhode Island. I mean, Rhode Island is just, you know, it's run by a bunch of radicals and extremists and who knows what, and they're out there with their own little state government, and they don't want to have anybody tell them that they can't issue paper money. And they figure correctly that one of the things that's going to come out of this is that this convention is going to lead to some way to prohibit any state from issuing paper money. And you know, paper money was sort of regarded by all the property people, all the respectable people. That paper money is regarded as sort of a scam that's nothing more than a threat to a way to steal money. So you know, and Rhode Island doesn't have anything to do with anything that would prohibit them from issuing paper money. So they didn't even send a delegation. So the other 12 people get together and say, okay, well, here we are, we're going to amend the Articles. It's obvious. I mean, I hope you all can see the obvious thing. Ain't going to happen. It would require all 13 states to ratify, and we know flat out that Rhode Island isn't going to do it. So what's the point of you meeting? I mean, we're doomed before we even start. We can't make any amendments to the Articles because we're not going to get all 13 states to ratify. And not only do we have Rhode Island that's saying no, we're not even going to be there, so we know that Rhode Island isn't going to approve anything that we come up with. And then the delegations from a couple of other states are saying, yeah, our state legislature, they sent us here. They did agree to send a delegation, and so they hired us to go to come here to Philadelphia and meet with you guys. But we're pretty sure they're not going to approve anything that we come up with. We know our state. We know our legislature. We're probably, most of them were members of their state legislatures. Most of the delegates were people who were experienced in government, and they'd been in local government, and many of them had been in their legislatures. Many were in the legislatures at the time. And they know what's going on. They know their state, and they know the political mood in their state, and they know that there is not any support for changing any of these things that we're talking about. So, it ain't going to happen. So, they're looking at this and they say, why should we start? It's doomed. I mean, this is an exercise in futility. We can't do anything and amend the articles. So then the people there, with Hamilton playing a key role, and other people coming on and say, well, let's just not give up on this. Let's go ahead and do something here. Let's see what we can do. We're going to just change the rules. And who's authorizing them to change the rules? They're just doing it. They're going to say, let's not just amend the articles. Forget about that. That isn't going to happen. Let's not even try to do that. Let's not even talk about that. Let's not even think about that. It's a waste of time. Let's instead just draft a constitution. We're going to start with a whole new constitution. And forget about the articles. We're going to start from scratch. And let's not have it ratified by the states. Let's think of this in a different way. Let's think of this Constitution as not just amending the articles. It's not just changing the articles. It's going to be a whole new concept. It's going to be drastically different. It's not going to be a contract among the states, which have to be ratified by the state legislatures. It's going to be a contract among the people. The people of the United States will be ratifying a constitution, because this is going to be a constitution for the people of the United States, of a nation. And it's going to be ratified by the people, because it's going to be a contract among the people. It's not a contract among states, it's a contract among the people. So the people are going to have to ratify it. Now, we're going to do this the way that we always do things. We're going to do it through representatives. And we know we can't have, you can't have a mass meeting of, at the time there were about 3.5 million people in the country. You can't have a meeting with 3.5 million people. So we're going to have representatives. And we're going to do it because this is the way we're sort of set up. We're going to do it on a state-by-state basis, because the states are there. We're going to still, it's going to be among the states, but we're going to do it on, it's going to be among the people. It's going to be the people ratifying the convention, the Constitution. But they're going to do it on because that's the, it's just a matter of time and space and the ability to get together and how can you have a meeting and so forth. We're going to do it on a state-by-state basis. So in every state, we're going to have a special convention. And this is not the state legislature. This is a separate convention in each state where the people will choose representatives. The people will choose their representatives to a ratifying convention so that the people can ratify the Constitution, but they're going to do it through a convention, through their representatives, because, that's the way it works. You do things with representatives. But if the representatives do it, then that acts on behalf of the people. They're acting as the agents of the people So what they do will be valid and will be accepted. And then they started saying, well, now, how many states do we need? And the number they came up with was 9, which is a little bit weird. You know, there's no 13 is kind of an odd number to work with because it's a prime number. You can't have a you can't have a third or anything. I think it's a prime number 13. It's a hard number to work with. It's very inconvenient to work with the number 13 if you're trying to do some math here. So let's just say 9, and whatever the fraction that is, we don't care about it. We'll just say 9 states. And and they didn't exactly do it this way, but sort of the way they did it was, well, how many states do we think can ratify? How many states do you think are going to go along with this? Now, that sort of the delegates from some states were saying, we know that in our state there's not any support for this. This is not a popular thing. Our state legislature doesn't approve of this, and generally the people in our state are not sympathetic to the idea that we've got to change the articles. Because a lot of people are happy with the articles. You know, so we know that there's not much support for this. North Carolina was their delegates said we know there's not really any interest in this whole idea in our state. So they decided, well, let's see, how many states can we get? They said, well, it looks like we can probably get 9 states. Okay, let's have the rule be we need 9 states. You know, so they sort of decided, well, we can get 9 states, so let's make that the rule. We need 9 states. That isn't quite right, but I mean, I'm sort of exaggerating there a little bit, but that was sort of the way they went about it. But they said 9 states. And it's going to be the people, through a special representative body, a special convention in each state, will be doing the ratifying. All right, so let's see what we're going to do here. And we're going to, and forget about the articles, we're going to start from scratch. Well, it turned out that in the days before the actual holding of the convention, before the day they actually started having their sessions, the delegation from Virginia had been doing its homework. They'd been meeting privately, and they had come up with an entire draft of a constitution. They'd had a complete draft ready, sort of a first draft, presented to the whole body here in the standard way of doing things, the way you have a representative meeting. You know, you're going to have motions and seconds and you know, amendments and stuff like that. You know how to have a meeting, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to do a standard procedure here, and we're going to present a first draft. And it was done by Virginia, so it's called the Virginia Plan. Now, it's presented by the delegation as, and I think there were like 5 people from Virginia, 5 or 6 members. I don't know how big their delegation was, but the 5 of them had sort of done this together. And officially was presented by Governor Randolph, the governor of the state, who's the sort of the head of the delegation as the governor. But in reality, it was largely drafted by the junior member of the delegation, the youngest guy in their delegation, who's, you know, as the youngest, the junior member, he's sort of obscure, but it was largely his work. Now, the whole delegation, all of the people from Virginia in some of their private meetings, they had made some modifications, they'd sort of tinkered with it a little bit, but basically, there may be some changes, and you look at the actual details, you might say, oh, this is a little bit different. But for all intents and purposes, the Virginia Plan was written by James Madison. Madison was the author of the Virginia Plan. And what Madison has proposed is to turn out the United States into a true national republic. A republic at the national level, not just state level. I mean, every state had a state constitution providing for a republican government at the state. This is going to be a national republic. And that meant that everybody in the republic, that is, everybody in, you know what I mean, I don't have to tell you, white male, landowners, but they all will vote, and their vote has to basically be the same. I mean, these are This is a republic. Everybody's got to be the same in it. You can't have privileged people who have more power than anybody else. They're all voters have got to be the same. So what we've got to do is divide the whole country up into districts based on population. You're going to have, you're going to decide you got to do the numbers here, and the numbers aren't going to work out right, but you do the best you can. You just get the numbers as close as possible. That you're going to have a bunch of districts in the country, and each district is going to have the same number of voters. I mean, that's the voters are going to elect a representative from their district, so the number of voters in each district has to be at least as close as you can get the numbers. You don't even have problems with maps and so forth, but trying to get the districts to all to have the same number of people, so that each district represents the same number of voters, of people. And of course, the implication of that is that large states will have more districts because they have more people. I mean, large states by population. Which means that the largest state is going to have the most members of Congress. I mean, if you just look at the math of this, it's just a mathematical necessity. And no surprise, the largest state is Virginia. So Virginia is going to have the most members of Congress, which is, of course, what Virginia has been complaining about forever. I mean, under the Articles, every state had the same vote. Each state casts one vote, which means that Virginia has one vote in Congress, and these other states that nobody's ever heard of, I mean, who's ever heard of Rhode Island or Delaware? I mean, these little tiny states, they each have the same vote, and that's not right. Virginia has, and I can't remember all the numbers, but Virginia has as many people as the 5 small states together. And yet each of those states has one member of Congress, and Virginia they have one vote in Congress. Virginia has one vote. They don't like it. So there's a real feeling in Virginia that the Articles is unfair to large states like them, and this Virginia plan, the Madison plan, will change that. The Virginia plan will give states that are larger a larger number of members of Congress. So they're very supportive of the Virginia plan. But as you can kind of guess, for the same reason that Virginia and the large states like the Virginia plan, small states don't. So in our next class, we'll start looking at the small states in the Constitutional Convention. And we'll start at that point and see how they react to the Virginia plan, which they don't like. Now, your question for today is, and as I say, I've always tried to make these as questions that you could easily answer if you've been at class and if you've been paying attention, if you've taken notes. What was the Shays Rebellion about? What were Shays and his fellow rebels trying to do?